Hello, good afternoon or good morning for those of you on the West Coast. My name is Hillary Stevens. I'm the Coastal Resilience Manager at Restore America's Estuaries, and we're very happy to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon. We are talking today about the economic value of America's estuaries. This is an update to a report that we did just over 10 years ago. So we're going to be looking at what's happened in the last decade. We'll be hearing from some of the experts that produced this report, and I'm very happy to welcome you today. This is a webinar, so all of the attendees have been muted. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, we ask that you drop them into the chat, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and we will take those and be reading them to the panelists at the end. If you have any questions, please enter them throughout, but we will be holding them until the end of the webinar. At this time, I will go ahead and introduce our speakers. Our first speaker today is Carrie Selberg Robinson. She's the Director of the Office of Habitat Conservation at NOAA. She has served as the Deputy Director and NOAA Fisheries Chief of Staff. She joined NOAA in 2005 as a legislative specialist after 5 years at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. She has a degree in environmental studies from Connecticut College and a master's in environmental management from Duke University. We'll then hear from some remarks from Daniel Hayden, who is the president and CEO of Restore America's Estuaries. Then we will hear from Tracy Rulo, who is the president and founder of TBD Economics. She's a senior economist with the Stimson Center, a senior fellow at the Center for the Blue Economy, an editorial board member for the Journal of Ocean and Coastal Economics. Prior to starting TBD, she was deputy chief economist for NOAA. She holds a master's in environmental studies from San Jose State University and completed her doctoral coursework and exams in marine policy fisheries economics at the University of Delaware. Again, thank you all for being here today. And with that, I will hand it over to Carrie.
Hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here today, and I'm excited to see such great attendance for our webinar. And I appreciate Ray's invitation to join us. I want to start off by thanking Ray for bringing us together today around this really important topic. For over 20 years, my office, which is NOAA's Office of Habitat Conservation, and Ray have been partnering on protecting and restoring America's estuaries. And as all of you know, Ray does a fabulous job of bringing together our estuarine conservation community, from local restoration practitioners to large conservation organization, really bringing together the people who are on this call on really important topics. So I'd like to state the obvious. We all know estuaries are really important. They provide important habitat for fish and wildlife. Nearly 40% of Americans live near or on an estuary, and estuary regions are some of the most economically valuable in our country. And estuaries play a really important role in protecting communities from the impacts of flooding, climate change, and sea level rise. And habitats like salt marshes and seagrass beds serve as natural infrastructure that protect coastal communities from flooding and erosion. So all of you know all of that. And that brings us to what are we going to learn about today, and why we supported Ray on this project. So when Ray proposed an update to the 2009 Economic and Market Value of Coast and Estuaries, What's at Stake report, my office wholeheartedly agreed that a more current look at the economic value of estuaries would be an important tool for all of us at NOAA and for all of our partners in conservation. A better understanding of what these valuable systems are worth is a really critical tool for preserving and restoring the coastal habitats in these places that are important to our communities. And we are really excited about what came of that. So after a 2-year collaboration with Ray and TBD Economics, we're excited about the release of this report and what we can all learn from it, what we can learn about the value of estuaries through the analysis. Socioeconomic research like this report help us understand and then communicate how healthy coastal ecosystems support resilient coastal communities. We're also really eager to learn more about the value of our estuaries in protecting our coastal communities from the impacts of flooding and climate change. The overarching take-home messages from this report help emphasize the importance of estuarine habitats to our society. And this report is going to be one more tool in our collective toolbox as we continue to enhance our messaging about the values of estuaries. So in my office, we plan on using this report, and we hope all of you do too. With that, I will pass it over to Daniel.
Thanks very much for that introduction. I think if we could switch it over to some PowerPoints, I'll walk through those. While the PowerPoints are loading up, I do want to just thank NOAA for their financial and technical support in putting together this presentation and this report. As Carrie said, this is a multi-year engagement with her team. We definitely couldn't have done it without her, as well as the staff at TB Economics, and also the communication support from Zambia Media. Just really emphasize that the focus of the report is on the economics of estuaries. We're really focusing on the things that we can measure. But as we kind of go through the report and all the data, I hopefully won't lose sight of the other values of estuaries. You know, the ecological benefits of estuaries as fish hatcheries and bird sanctuaries, our personal experiences enjoying estuaries, going there for vacations, holidays, or working there, and the role that they play in sustaining vibrant coastal communities. So keep all those things in mind as we go through a whole series of numbers. So if you could turn to the next slide, please. So Tracy will go into more detail on this, but this does focus on economic benefits from coastal counties in the continental United States. So it's limited to the continental United States. Next slide, Rob. As Carrie said, you know, I think we all know this, estuaries are small places with huge economic impact. They're 4% of the continental landmass of the US. 8 of our 10 largest cities are along estuaries. 40% of our US population and 47% of our gross domestic product are all generated from estuary counties. So what happens in estuaries affects all of us. When storms hit the Gulf Coast, we immediately see a rise in energy prices. When cities like Norfolk floods, our national defense is compromised. And the list of sort of the impacts of how estuaries affect us as a country go on and on. So next slide, please. So what we want to do is take a look at a nationwide level of economic benefits of estuaries. And it's actually fairly hard to do, and Tracy will get into that. The key point of this report is also sort of 6 case studies that take a deep dive and have comparable data across all the sites, looking at 2 new important categories. The first is blue carbon, and the second is natural infrastructure. And just looking at these 2 factors at these 6 sites, you can see that they generate between 0.6 billion and 3.7 billion in carbon sequestration value alone, and between $1 and $3 billion in avoided property losses. So we can sort of imagine the impact they have on our country as a whole. Go on to the next slide. So we published our initial report in 2008. And so what's happened since then? Next slide. So the first thing is that in that subsequent decade, 15% more Americans live in coastal communities, especially within the Gulf region. So there's now more people and more property at risk than ever before. Next slide. And what we've seen over the last decade is there's now 2 times the number of billion-dollar-plus storms as there were just a decade ago. And tragically, this has resulted in 69% more deaths over the last decade. So these are trends that we're seeing across the entire country. So going to the next slide, Americans are seeing this. 63% of Americans are saying they're seeing the impact of climate change today. So this is no longer a future problem, it's today's reality. And my hunch is after this past summer of record storms, flooding, and hurricanes, this number should go even higher, unfortunately. So going on to the next slide, what we also know is that these storms and weather events are not impacting all communities the same. There's an increasing body of research that shows that economically disadvantaged communities are impacted much worse by coastal flooding and storms than other communities. And a lot of the data that comes out is being driven from FEMA storm recovery data that focuses strictly on property losses. But we also know that these storms have immense human tolls, are disruptive in family lives and disruptive in community activity. And it's very hard for these communities who are already struggling to recover post-storm events. So next slide. So there's a clear case for investment in our coasts. On the next slide, you'll see that there's currently, so Rob, the next slide, please. For every $1 invested in mitigation, we save $6 in recovery, while concurrently avoiding all the human suffering and improving habitats. Next slide. We also see that for every $1 million invested in habitat restoration, creates an average of 17 jobs per $1 million. So this is a much higher rate of return than traditional industries such as coal, gas, or nuclear energy generation. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to continue to invest in our coast while investing in our economy. Next slide. We also know the value of this natural infrastructure. There's been a lot of studies that show that property behind wetlands has less storm damage. In one case study from New Jersey, where we were a couple of weeks ago for the Living Shorelines workshop, we could see a 16% reduction in storm damage in properties behind coasts. And there's studies that show that's even higher, up to 22% reduction in storm damage behind wetlands. So clearly, this natural infrastructure is paying returns. So if we go on to the next slide. So there's a lot of things that's going on. And we just want to say it's really critical to sustain and increase federal and state investments in our coasts. However, it's not just a sort of a government-led opportunity to invest in our coasts. What we can see is that there's a vibrant market in the voluntary carbon markets. It's growing quickly. It's estimated that voluntary carbon markets will grow to about $50 billion by 2030. And this provides an opportunity to fund investments in our coast, particularly in blue carbon, as an incremental finance tool. In addition, sort of the attribution of blue carbon value to the wetlands increases their value between $3,000 and $8,000 per hectare of wetlands. So there's a lot of opportunity here to develop collaborations between federal, state, and local governments, as well as the private sector, to continue investment in our estuaries. So next slide. So we've gone through a ton of data so far. And a lot of times we sort of think about the conversation of infrastructure and nature as sort of two separate things. And really, as you sort of go through the report and evidence and information presented today, you'll see that nature is our infrastructure, and we need to continue to invest it. The case for estuaries is that it protects us from storms, it creates the ports for our transportation, and it does all these things by creating great recreational opportunities and beautiful places to visit. So we're excited to discuss both the economic value and cultural value of our nation's estuaries. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. We're waiting to load the slides. I'll just start by saying my name's Tracy Rulo. I am the president of TBD Economics. And I wanted to thank Ray for having us here today. I also want to thank all the folks on the webinar. We've got a great crowd today, and I'm really excited to be talking about this project, the Value of America's Estuaries, the 2021 update. And this was a really exciting project for us, and there were a lot of people who contributed to it. I want to thank particularly our team members, Charlie Colgan from the Center for the Blue Economy. Charlie is my partner in crime, and this report relies heavily on his expertise and his knowledge. I'd also like to thank the rest of our team, Jeff Adkins, Tony Castelletto, Patty Durham, Shannon Lyons, Christian McCann, Charles Rhodes, Zach Spencer, and last but certainly not least, Ariana Sutton-Greer, who is a blue carbon expert. We'd like to thank NOAA for their support as well. particularly Carrie Selberg Robinson and the Habitat Office for support of the report. And then also Melanie Gange, Janine Harris, and Travis Grout. They helped us through multiple iterations of the report make it much better. So, and finally, I'd like to thank the folks at RAE, Dan Hayden, who just spoke, for following through on this long, hard slog to the finish. Rob Shane for his communications expertise and for organizing the webinar. I did want to give a nod to Pat Montanio and Jeff Benoit, formerly of NOAA and RAE, who were with us on the early stages of this and really helped get the project off the ground. And then most of all, to Hillary Stevens, of course, who started us off and showed immeasurable patience and got us over the finish line. Next slide. So the first Value of America's Estuaries report was published on January 28th, 2009. And back then, it was a great primer on valuing ecosystem services. Interest was rising in the federal government, and there was a lot of good work being done at the time. I remember having lunch with Pat Montanio, and we were talking about it, and I sort of started thinking about a decadal update, and she thought it was a great idea. She connected me with Jeff at RAE, and now, good Lord, 4 years later, we're finally getting to talk about it. We decided we wanted to keep pieces of the original report, and the report published in 2009, which you see on the screen, and our current report are linked by the regional analysis, and that's essentially the first chapter. It keeps the focus of the importance of estuaries to the national economy. Charlie Colgan, my partner and co-author, who couldn't be on the call today, developed the regional analysis for the original report as well as for this one. So it was a really nice piece of continuity in having him on as an author on both reports. The original report addressed the best known, at least at the time, ecosystem services, those that comprise what most people think about when we talk about the ocean economy or the marine economy, as we're calling it now. Tourism and recreation, commercial fisheries, ports and shipping, and energy infrastructure. Those services that estuaries provide that people are aware of because they impact their everyday lives. They're bought and sold in markets, et cetera. However, we decided we wanted to update the 2009 report with a more contemporary view of ecosystem services by including 6 case studies that assess emerging ecosystem services and that reflect the current thinking about estuaries and the benefits they provide. They connect estuaries directly to the climate crisis facing our nation and the world. National infrastructure and coastal blue carbon are the 2 new services that we've introduced. Natural infrastructure, I'm gonna now just talk briefly about the methods and then we'll get on to the results, which I'm sure you're all waiting for. Natural infrastructure or flood resilient services were determined by identifying the wetlands that fronted or protect economic assets in 6 case study estuaries that we chose for the report. These economic assets include homes, buildings, businesses, and then we used a benefits transfer approach with natural infrastructure benefits identified from assessments that were completed after Superstorm Sandy. So essentially, we basically took the information that we got in terms of natural flood resilience from Superstorm Sandy and applied it to the estuaries across the nation. I want to point out that the natural infrastructure or the flood resilience benefits represent avoided costs to buildings and residences only. There are additional impacts of floods that are likely to be experienced by local communities that aren't reflected in this assessment. And, you know, to be frank, we couldn't do everything in such a large scale report. And as I'm sure you all know, there's also many additional benefits from natural infrastructure beyond flood resilience that we did not count either. The coastal blue carbon benefits were measured only in estuarine emergent marshes. We did have to limit our approach to one land cover type because frankly, the carbon equation got complicated if we went either upstream or downstream of the emergent marshes. Emergent marshes are what most of us call salt marshes, for those of you who are not wetlands biologists. And for the 6 case studies, we focused on these emergent marshes, with the exception, estuarine emergent marshes, with the exception of Tampa Bay, where we looked at mangroves. The aerial extent of the salt marsh in each case study was identified using GIS and NOAA's CCAP land cover database. And then we developed carbon profiles for each estuary using the land cover data, using the land cover database and carbon cores from the Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network database. The coastal blue carbon values were estimated by multiplying the stock of carbon in the emergent estuary and land cover class by estimates of the social cost of carbon published by the Interagency Working Group on the social cost of greenhouse gases. So basically, we are taking the social cost of carbon, that value, and multiplying it by the amount of carbon that we determined was available in each estuary. And then we used various discount rates to develop ranges of value. So it's a big report. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it. It's close to 160 pages, and it contains a lot of information. I've only got a very short time today, and I need to cover a lot of ground. Sorry, there's a bee flying around my head right now. If know how he got in the house. I won't be reviewing the methods in much more detail, but I'm going to focus really on the results. The methods are described in detail in the report, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions on them if we have time during the discussion, or happy to chat offline after today. So please feel free to get in touch with me. Yeah, you can go ahead and move to the next slide. On to the results. So in the decades since the last report, we found that employment and GDP, for those of you who aren't economists, GDP is really economists speak for, and I'm using air quotes here, the economy. Employment and GDP grew faster in estuary regions than in the US as a whole. That's a big finding. The marine economy provided over 3 million jobs and contributed over 300 billion to the economy. So keep in mind that the marine economy is only ocean or Great Lakes dependent industries. Our estuary regions support the marine economy, but they also support other parts of the national economy. And economists look at those two types of economies as different pieces. For those of you who have been paying attention, this really shouldn't be a big surprise. We know that most of our major urban areas are located in estuaries, and so it makes sense that they would contain the most jobs and the most dollars. What this means to me, though, and to economists like me who think about these things, is that our estuaries are under increasing pressure, and that risk continues to grow as employment grows, as the coasts get more crowded. I think it was just yesterday at COP26 that John Kerry announced that the United States is planning to develop a sustainable ocean plan. And I think that's probably it'll probably be on many of us on this call to make sure that that plan includes estuaries and not just our ocean economy. The largest marine economy employer is tourism and recreation. And this generally stays consistent from year to year. This is in terms of jobs, not necessarily dollars. There are other industries that contribute more in terms of dollars, but in terms of jobs, tourism and recreation are the big winner. Makes sense, right? Who doesn't love a nice vacation at the coast? It's also, but marine tourism and recreation is also an important sector for sustainability, because tourism and recreation is one of the ocean economy industries that's most directly connected to the health of our estuaries. Your enjoyment of the beach, or your enjoyment of an estuary, or your enjoyment of a coastal vacation relies on you being able to see wildlife and to fish recreationally, clean beaches, clean water. Those things all are, depend on and are tied inextricably to the tourism and recreation economy. The final point I'll make here about the regional assessment is that a lot of the growth that we're seeing in our estuaries is starting to shift upstream. So we're seeing these estuary areas that are defined in the map. We sort of define them by the watershed. And the growth in those estuaries is starting to move upstream. And this means that the pressure is now not going to only be on the coasts, but also upstream of them. And the cumulative effects of the increased development and pollution will magnify as they run off and travel downstream to the estuary. Next slide. So in the report, we essentially took the results from the 6 case studies and combined them all into these 2 big summary tables. And that's what I'm going to sort of focus the rest of my comments on. One of the reasons we really did this report is we wanted to be able to look across different types of estuaries and see how the values differed and what were the parameters and the characteristics of these estuaries that made them either more or less valuable than another. So this table is one of the two summary tables that combines those results. This table is the assessment of the natural infrastructure or flood resilience and blue carbon benefits, and it's total value in millions. So this is the total value for each estuary. I mentioned earlier that we won't be going in depth on the methods, but I did want to explain the difference between the high and low estimates. And in this table, you can see the first column shows the area, and it shows the area of wetlands that were measured for natural infrastructure. It shows the area that was measured for coastal blue carbon. And then you'll see that there's a low estimate and a high estimate for natural infrastructure, a low estimate and a high estimate for coastal blue carbon. And then we've added the natural infrastructure and blue carbon benefits together, also with a low and high. And I want to explain the difference between the low estimates and the high estimates. The values are all in millions of dollars. So for the natural infrastructure, we based our damage costs on the impacts of a 100-year storm. So that represents the lowest estimates under the natural infrastructure column. So essentially, when a 100-year storm hits, we looked at the damage function, we looked at the assets that were being protected by the wetlands, and that's how we came up with the value. We wanted to include the impacts of climate change in the report, and so that's what our high estimate represents. We changed the probability from the 100-year storm to becoming a 50-year storm, effectively doubling the estimates. And so that type of storm would be expected to occur twice as often. And so that's what you see for the high estimates in natural infrastructure. For the blue carbon benefits, all of the benefits are based on the social cost of carbon. So the full analysis also includes estimates based on market rates. The lowest estimates versus the highest estimates in the coastal blue carbon columns are merely a function of choosing different discount rates. Discount rates are basically what economists use to either decide whether how much importance you place on future benefits versus current benefits. And then the other thing I wanted to mention about the table is that the color coding is simply to help you see the highest and the lowest values more easily. The highest values are the lightest color, they're yellow. The lower values are darker colors with the lowest values in the darkest green. So I think I've mentioned this in a first order analysis. It's a high level analysis, and we're just beginning to understand these values. And we're framing these results as understanding and evaluating future risks. In a world where climate change is first and foremost in the minds of policymakers and coastal managers, the benefits described in this table are present now, as long as the wetlands we analyzed remain intact. With increasing pressures from population growth, a growing economy, and of course, climate change, these benefits are at risk if the estuaries aren't protected and restored. Most of the rest of what we found is derived from local conditions, and so it shows that sort of geography matters and influences value. In the first two columns, you can see that size matters. You can see that in some of the areas, we had much larger aerial extent of wetlands that provided natural infrastructure. 62,000 acres for Pamlico Sound, 34,000 acres for Tampa Bay. And then in coastal blue carbon, you can see that the big winner by far was 133,000 hectares. I'm sorry if I said acres, it's hectares of coastal blue carbon was in Terrebonne Basin. So the size of the area of the availability of these benefits definitely made a big difference. I did want to point out that Pamlico Sound versus Tampa Bay, you can see that Pamlico Sound has almost twice as many hectares as Tampa Bay. But when you look to the values, the second set of columns under natural infrastructure, you can see that the highest estimate for Pamlico Sound is only 219 million, where the Tampa Bay estimate is much larger. It's essentially 2.7 billion. The reason, or salt marshes, and the mangroves. I'm getting a message. Oh, sorry, I just got a message. My connection was unstable. So the mangroves have a higher protective function than the wetlands do, and so that's one of the contributing factors to that high number. The other contributing factor, which is really important to be thinking about, is that the economic assets that sit behind the wetlands in Tampa just are more valuable. These values we get from property tax databases and local databases from cities, essentially we look at the property taxes and we look at the values of the properties. And in Tampa Bay, the properties that were protected by wetlands are much higher, a much higher value than the properties that are protected in Pamlico Sound. And the blue carbon, you can see, obviously, as I've mentioned, Terrebonne Basin was the big winner. And that largely is due to the size, the sheer amount of wetlands that exist in Terrebonne Basin that hold great riches of blue carbon. Can we go to the next slide? I think, though, that this table actually tells a better story. We were just talking about the blue carbon values in the Terrebonne Basin, and this table is the same table, except for it's the value per hectare. So it's basically adjusting for size, right? So we're looking now at each of these estuaries, and we're looking at a single, common area across the 6 case studies. And you can see in the far right most column, the highest estimate for coastal blue carbon, the Terrebonne Basin was $18,000 approximately, $18,600 per hectare in terms of the value of the blue carbon stored in those estuaries. You see that Pamlico actually had higher values, $19,500 per hectare. But as you remember, the real reason that you get the bigger numbers in Terrebonne is because you look over here at the wetlands, the area extent, and you'll see again that there's 133,000 acres of wetlands in Terrebonne Basin and only about 37,000 in Pamlico Sound. Again, we look back to the Tampa Bay question. Tampa Bay estuary has the highest values for flood protection benefits, and I've talked about why that is. Their numbers are almost twice as much as the next closest one, which is Great Egg Harbor. Great Egg Harbor also protects a lot of valuable infrastructure. And so you can see the estimates in terms of the value per hectare for Great Egg and Tampa Bay are much higher than what you see in Pamlico Sound, which is a less urban estuary. And Snohomish and San Pablo are different cases, but I'll talk about them next. Which brings us back to this idea that the local context matters, right? San Pablo, for instance, was low in terms of natural infrastructure because the value of the assets protected wasn't as high as in the other areas. So in San Pablo Bay, the wetlands front or sit in front of, it's largely an area of warehouses and commercial activity that is already structured so that the lesser valued assets are along the shoreline, the bigger valued assets are further inland. They don't protect a lot of homes. They don't protect a lot of high value assets. It has rich carbon stores, San Pablo San Pablo Bay estuary has rich carbon stores, but they aren't quite as rich as the wide swaths of relatively untouched wetlands in Terrebonne and Pamlico. And so again, we go back to the highest estimate, the rightmost column, and we see that the numbers for San Pablo Bay are high, $10,000 approximately per hectare, but they're not quite as high as Pamlico and Terrebonne, those relatively rural estuaries, versus San Pablo Bay, which of course is in the middle of the busy San Francisco Bay area. I might add, I used to actually live on San Pablo Bay, so it is one of my personal favorites. Great Egg Harbor, I think we talked about this a little bit, but I do want to mention, you can see it's here, the value for the coastal blue carbon is in the middle. It's in between Pamlico Sound and Terrebonne Basin, And to be honest, I think we were, the authors of the study were a little bit surprised by that. Great Egg Harbor, if you don't know where it is, it's in New Jersey, just behind Atlantic City. And so, but they've done a wonderful job really setting aside these large areas of wetlands to restore and to protect. And so the commercial assets, and so they've built up a rich store of carbon. But in those areas, the value of real estate in New Jersey is fairly high, again, which is why you're going to get that $42,000 per acre as your high estimate for natural infrastructure. Lastly, another urban estuary, Snohomish Estuary, turned out to be small, both in terms of area of wetlands. So what we found was Snohomish Estuary was much smaller than we anticipated it was going to be when we finally got down to looking at where there were wetlands that protected infrastructure and where there were estuarine emergent wetlands that held carbon stores. So the real basis between those low numbers largely is largely reliant on the small area, but you can also see Snohomish Estuary, another urban estuary. It's just north of Everett in Puget Sound, which is a very busy city, about an hour north of Seattle. You can see that the blue carbon there isn't quite as rich as in other areas that are less developed. And you can also see that the areas that it protects, the assets that it protects, aren't as high value as what you're seeing in places like Great Egg Harbor and Tampa Bay. So the last point I'll make here is, I want to reiterate the point that I made earlier, that we only measured 2 ecosystem services. And, and we came up with some pretty big numbers, which, I think is important to understand and those numbers in the billions of dollars are just a tiny piece of the full value of estuaries. It's made up of a lot more than just coastal blue carbon values and avoided costs from floods. So a tiny piece of the puzzle we're looking at here, but we're looking at it at the national scale, and it's an important piece of the puzzle. Next slide, please. So some of the key messages I want to send home today. The first is these first order assessments. So these are, we call this a first order assessment because there's a lot of work that's being done in much more detail at the local level based on local conditions using local data. But the need for this sort of national level consistent methodology that you can use across the entire United States are very helpful to guide policy decisions. And the local detailed assessments are also needed for project siting and management. So there's room for both types of assessments. And what you need to understand is that economists understand that those numbers are going to be different because we're looking at slightly different numbers, because the local assessments are going to have much more detail. They are going to probably be more closer to the quote unquote true value. Economists don't really like to talk about that term, but because it depends on how you look at it. But for this national type approach, these first order assessments really can help to show us what the total values are and what really is at risk for the nation. As I've just talked about, the first order assessments are very conservative. A lot of assumptions that we made, we always err on the side of conservative. So the numbers are likely to be much larger, and those local studies will help to reveal those additional values. This point I've made a couple of times. The values that are presented in this report rely on keeping the existing wetlands intact. Our assumption is that those values, the blue carbon and the natural infrastructure values, are present today. The study timeframe is over a period of 30 years. So we took those the values and the benefits and stretched them out over 30 years. But if the wetlands are developed, the values are lost. And then the location of the wetlands matters. Natural infrastructure and flood resilience benefits require wetlands between oncoming wind and water and economic assets. That was one of the problems we had in particular in Terrebonne, where the wetlands, with one small exception, which actually turned out to be outside of the boundary of our study, Port Fourchon, the economic assets didn't sit behind the wetlands. So there was a lot of wetlands and then there was economic assets, but they weren't directly in the way. The wetlands weren't necessarily protecting those economic assets. And so it's important to be thinking about that when you're thinking about particularly flood resilience benefits. The location of your wetlands matters. You need to basically make sure that they are working, as we all think about it, as a shield, right? A shield to protect our communities from oncoming wind and oncoming waves. And then I think the important thing, particularly this week, COP26 is happening over in Glasgow as we speak. And I think the blue carbon values really provide good context and insight for two things. For developing carbon markets, we know now there's a lot of existing carbon that sits in these estuaries. And also as we develop the nationally determined contributions for blue carbon, this piece, I think, helps to add information to that equation. I think the biggest point that I'd like to make today before I close is that conserved wetlands hold billions of dollars in value today. We know that, we've shown that. These are conservative numbers. The total values are obviously much higher. But the best opportunity for increasing those values is going to come from restoration efforts, keeping those wetlands healthy, keeping those estuaries clean and healthy and strong, and restoring them so that we can continue to build on the value that exists today. I think this is the last slide. Next slide, please, Rob. Yeah, so thank you very much. Again, thank you so much to Restore America's Estuaries, and thank you so much to NOAA. My contact information and Charlie's contact information are here on the slide. And that's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Tracy, so much for walking us through some of the key findings there. And I have to really echo your point there at the end about the value that comes for restoration, but also the extraordinary importance of preventing any further losses. This has been underscored time and time again in our blue carbon work, recognizing that the value in our existing wetlands is so critical, and preventing the loss of anything further is really an extremely high priority. Let me go ahead and lean into some of we've had some questions coming in, and let's see. I will start with, do you know of any reports or case studies that illustrate the value of the Great Lakes specifically? Do you have anything you could highlight there?
Well, I say I don't know I know those reports exist, absolutely. I know there's been several done. I don't know the specifics on them. I think the best place to go, I know NOAA has some Great Lakes pages. I think Sea Grant also is another great place to go. Sea Grant, of course, NOAA, but but yeah, so I do know those reports exist. I don't know specifically of them.
Okay, thank you. Next question, this individual writes, I have been exploring ecological economics perspectives on evaluating the natural capital and ecosystem service, which includes, and this is an acronym, MINDS, Multi-Scale Integrated Earth Systems Model. How does the RAE economics valuation differ from the MINDS approach? Are you familiar with this to speak to it?
So not really. So, there's a lot of integrated models of ecosystem services. I think the main difference is that the approach we used is not sort of based on an economic model, but it's based on sort of traditional environmental economics techniques, right? And so there's modeling approaches which are great to sort of show how natural capital flows, stocks and flows work together. The approaches we used, we just certainly chose the different approach. Our approach is essentially a benefits transfer approach, I'm sorry, where we took the benefits that were identified by Narayan et al. In the Sandy studies for estuarine emergent wetlands during Hurricane Sandy, and then applied them across the estuaries. I would say that the MIMES approach, I'm not familiar with it particularly, but is probably going to be a good approach for a different purpose. Again, there's lots of different answers you can have. There's lots of different reasons that you want to create economic information. Our reason was to give this first order understanding so that folks like Carrie and Dan can go out and say, you know, we know estuaries are important, and here's how important they are. I think the MIMES approach would probably result in values that would be used for a different purpose.
Great, thank you. The value of existing infrastructure seems like it should be compared with the future value of the natural areas to avoid the destruction that would occur because of sea level rise or storm surge. So this is an interesting one. We went with the databases that are available for current value. Do you want to speak to decisions about trying to take future values into account?
Let's see, I'm going to read this. The value of existing infrastructure seems like it should be compared with the future value of natural areas to avoid the destruction. So in essence, Margarita, it looks like that's who wrote this. That's what we did. So the value of the existing infrastructure is used as one of the values of maintaining the wetlands that are in front of it over the next 30 years. And so the assumptions that are made in the report that we published assume that natural infrastructure, those natural areas are kept intact for 30 years and continue to provide those protective benefits. I think that answers your question, but I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. Next question, is there a minimum width of marsh or mangrove fringe to realize the noted resiliency? In other words, would a 10-foot wide area of wetlands provide benefits, or does it need to be greater than 30 feet, for example? Mangroves would likely need less widths. Do you want to speak to, yeah.
Yep, so yes, certainly. I think the other important thing to be thinking about when you're talking about mangrove forests is the age of the forest, right? So one of the things we do know is that the benefits that mangrove forests provide sort of increase exponentially as the mangrove forest gets older. If you've ever seen a mangrove, you know, the young forests there's a lot of space in between the trunks, and as it gets older and more mature, it gets very tangled. Now, the question about the actual width of the mangrove between the asset and the water, that I think is a perfect example of something that would be very useful in a local study, right? So we did not put a limit on whether it was 10 feet or whether it was 100 feet of mangrove between the water and the assets. We just measured the space. Now, I am sure that in local assessments, and in fact, there's probably one in Tampa Bay that Ray has published that we could look at. It shows the difference that, you know, of having a smaller aerial extent in front of a protected asset than a wider one. But we basically did not, our value is sort of static. We did not, I would imagine that as it grows, there's probably some curve that shows that the wider it gets, the more protection it provides, but we use just static numbers, again, because we were doing such a large scale assessment.
And as the person writing the question may be aware, there is some really interesting research out there looking into, particularly with mangroves, but I think with salt marshes as well, about the width of mangrove and how the effect that it has, trying to really quantify and model the effect that it has on dampening wave energy and so forth. So that is very definitely a lively research topic. Next question, why are Hawaii and Alaska not included in this national assessment? Very good question.
Excellent question. And I'm with whoever said that. I actually worked on Alaska issues for a long time, and Alaska and Hawaii are always left off. The real reason is largely because the original report did not include Alaska and Hawaii. And I don't know why the original report didn't do it, but because we wanted the new report to be consistent with the original report, we had to keep it to the CONUS. I will say that Alaska and Hawaii were included when we selected the estuaries, which I didn't go into because we didn't have a lot of time, but we had a list of like 25 estuaries that we started with, and we whittled that list down to 5, if you remember. And then Noah's like, oh, can we get one more? And I said, yeah, sure. And so, but that was a really difficult process. And in that list of 25 estuaries that we started with, there were several from both Hawaii and from Alaska. So I do apologize. I know Alaska and Hawaii need more love, and but it largely was based on the fact that the original report just didn't include them, and we wanted to just be as consistent as possible.
Daniel or Carrie, did you want to comment to that or the Great Lakes question, or indeed any of them so far?
So it sounds like 2 great things. One, to include Alaska and Hawaii in the next version of the report. Hopefully, cue that out, maybe not wait 10 more years for it to happen.
I was going to say, we might want to start now, right?
To expand that. And I just would highlight the report does cover the Great Lakes as part of our coast. And the data, and a lot of the data tables are there looking at Great Lakes. But there was not a case study from a Great Lake. But we do include those as part of our coastal infrastructure.
Okay, next question. Can you give us a breakdown of the 17 jobs, $1 million invested in restoration? What % are direct versus indirect? And do we know what those roles and industries tend to be where the job creation occurs?
So that is a good question, and I will have to get back to you on the details. It does look at, I think it's all direct, but I'll double check and get back to you. So
I can actually speak to that a little bit.
Great, thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, because my buddy Peter Edwards, who I went to grad school with, actually published that paper when I was at NOAA. The 17 jobs are all direct. There's removal of invasives. It was, I think, the big winner. If you all remember, I don't know how many guys are around. Carrie, you must have been around when that report came out. But it's things like construction. So I actually have a whole slide on the value of the restoration economy, but a lot of it is the construction work that happens, right? When you're restoring an estuary, dirt is moved and people are planting things. And so all of those jobs are the types of things that are included. There's also, like I said, removal of invasives. So one of the things that they do is they want to get rid of the sort of plants that we don't want there and replant with natives. And that is all, those are, that was, is my understanding, was the most sort of labor intensive and of the various jobs that were in that paper, which was by Peter Edwards, if anybody is interested. And I don't know, Ariana, who's on this call, I think might have even been a co-author of that, published in, I think, 2012 or 14. But it's essentially those, the high labor jobs were particularly helpful in terms of, because there's a lot of really on the ground work, like pulling brush and digging trenches and breaking down dikes and tearing down dams, right? So all of those things are require construction, and they require people to do those jobs. And yes, you're correct, Dan. I don't know if I said it, but those are all direct jobs. The indirect jobs numbers are obviously higher.
Okay, that looks like we've addressed most of the questions that we've got coming in. Carrie, I wanted to offer you an opportunity to put some closing remarks here as we're wrapping up.
Well, I just took a scroll through the participant list, and it's great to see such high levels of participation, but also from a lot of different sectors. So I want to thank Tracy for the presentation and for the report. I'd like to thank Ray for bringing us all together. And I'd like to thank all of you for participating. I hope you learned something today, and it leads you to go dig into this report in some depth, and that you use the information here. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Okay, at this point, we will go ahead and wrap up. I want to direct your attention to the chat. Looks like Ariana has dropped her email in there if you want to get in touch with her to follow up for more info. And we've also dropped the link into the chat for this study. So when you are ready to dive into all 160 some odd pages of this, please do go to our website. It's estuaries.org. And you will see a link there, or you can just type it in, estuaries.org/economics. The full report is available there. We do, as Carrie said, we do encourage you to dive into it, whether it's in the main body of the report for some high-level information, or those case studies to really start thinking about how to go about quantifying some of these ecosystem services that are so critical to us all. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. A special thank you to Carrie for your support of this work, and to Tracy and your colleagues for everything you put into it. It's really been a pleasure working with you all. So thanks, and we will wrap up there. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Great, thanks very much.